our next group actually gets us into our behavioral perspectives. And again, if you know this psychology history, you know that our psychodynamic perspectives and our behavioral perspectives are pretty dramatic swings between one another. So our psychodynamic was all about sort of those internal processes, especially unconscious processes. Behaviorists are really going to be focused external only. So behaviorism has this idea that overt behavior is the only kind of behavior worth studying. Overt meaning external, something that you could observe, whereas internal behaviors would be covert behaviors because they are hidden within. So behaviorists are all about the external. And so when we look at these external forces, we can look at our interactions with our environment. This is stuff like learning from experience. I've encountered this situation before, I did this action and it worked really well for me. So now I'm going to do that again. Or I encountered this situation and I got in trouble for it, so I'm not doing that again. You learn to adjust your actions based on encounters. Now, at the bottom here, this is how I like to sort of explain the spectrum between behaviorism to cognitive behaviorism and then into cognitive psychology, because that's another perspective that comes up right away after this, where our psychodynamic individuals were all about unconscious internal forces. The cognitive psychologists are more about our cognitive and conscious minds. So still internal forces, but more of the stuff that we're aware of. And I always talk about cognitive behaviorism because that's where my research falls. Because I use behaviorist views, I use operant conditioning, but I'm using it to try and understand internal category formation. So I'm using that cognitive component, the thinking part, and I use more of a behaviorist, experience-driven research method. So you can have a little bit of both. So that's the reason for the stuff at the bottom here, where if we went pure behaviorist, you'd say that we don't care about the internal at all. It's all about external forces. If we go cognitive, we'd say that your mentality, your current cognitive processes, what you're thinking in the moment, has a pretty big influence on your actions in the moment. And if you're cognitive behaviorist, then you're doing a little bit of both. And you can look at how you think about things that you're encountering in your environment and how you consider what actions should or shouldn't happen based on past encounters. A little bit of both right in the middle. Now, if we're going to start with the behaviorist, though, we can start with the extreme behaviorism or a radical behaviorist, which is B.F. Skinner. Now, Skinner is always our example of sort of the purest and most radical of a behaviorist perspective because he was very extreme and he was very vocal in his extremeness. And you might remember Skinner, who we talked about back when we talked about language, and he was the one who said that he could explain human language learning entirely through operant conditioning. Basically, kids say a word, and if they say it right, they are reinforced, they get what they want, or they get praised for getting it right. And if they say it wrong, they don't get what they want, or they get corrected or punished for saying it wrong. So they learn to say the stuff that they get praised for, and they learn to avoid the stuff that they get punished for, and poof, they can now speak language properly. And of course, at the time, we found out that that's not exactly the whole picture, but that was his perspective. And that was his perspective towards everything. So if we think about that idea of if you do an action and it leads to a good outcome, you do the action more, or if you do something and it leads to a bad outcome, you do the action less, that's the base principle of operant conditioning. It's a form of learning where you learn which actions to do more or less based on your experiences, based on what you encounter in the environment. So for Skinner, how does that actually relate to personality? Because we've mentioned it in terms of language acquisition and general actions, do this action, don't do this action. How does that relate? Well, it's actually really just a weird way of framing it. Because if we think of it, personality is that consistency in behavior across time. And so if we're looking at personality from a behaviorist perspective, well, we're basically saying that if your environment is consistent, then your actions should be consistent too. And then in those cases, your personality is actually just a product of the fact that you've behaved the same in this environment because the environment hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot. And so personality isn't really something internal and inherent. It's actually something external and environment driven, and therefore fluid across time. So, what are some of the ways that we can see this consistency in our responses, in our actions, our behaviors? So, if we have a stimulus situation, so you go to a party and you don't know a lot of people, there's a couple of different responses or behaviors that you could engage in. You might circulate the room and speak to others if they approach you first. If people approach you and you talk to them and it goes well and now you're enjoying yourself, the next time that you go to a party, you're going to be a lot more likely to circulate and wait for people to approach you because that's gone really well in the past. Or I like it, the one at the bottom here. You leave at the first opportunity. Well, if you leave that situation, maybe it was really stressful, you didn't like being there, and you left and you went home and you put on pajamas and watched one of your comfort shows, you're like, this is way better than a party. The next time you go to a party, you're probably pretty quick to leave as soon as possible because last time it was way better to be home than to be here. So having a good outcome makes you more likely to do that behavior. And of course, if you do that consistently, you might then have people describe you as maybe you're introverted, maybe you don't like social situations. And because you've had good sort of experiences avoiding those social situations, you would agree. So, in those cases, that stability in your personality, from everyone's perspective, has come from consistency in your experiences that have now been maintained by your learning from the past. Another one of these examples, I just like keeping this one around, not because like it's the same example at the top of stimulus context as a party, but I just love the clip art that they use in some of these, so I have to keep them around. But here they're saying, you know, if you go to a party and you tell jokes and it gets you a bunch of people laughing, it is a good outcome. You're going to tell more jokes and you now become associated with being funny. Or if they fall flat, you might never tell a joke again, and now you might be seen as serious, but your experiences are going to have long-term influences on how you behave in similar environmental contexts in the future. So, all of that taken together, what does it tell us about personality? Personality is continuously developing and changing as we gain experience, and what looks like consistency in personality might actually just be drawn from consistency in experience and the environment in which we're in. So this can be explained externally. There's no need for an internal component. And for sure, Skinner, as a radical behaviorist, would say that the internal components are completely irrelevant and we don't need them at all. So this is very different from our other perspectives. And that's why we talk about this as sort of one weird quirk that we will then swing away from on a spectrum, because there's no focus on internal, there's no focus on the unconscious or even the conscious for that matter. And it's not broken down developmentally. It is all external experience based. There's no age, there's no sort of developmental process. It's what have you encountered before and how does that shape you long term? That's kind of it. So it's almost simple and maybe elegant in its simplicity, but it also doesn't line up with a lot of the ways that we think about personality. So we can take from that what we will. And if we want to continue sort of leaning back towards a little bit more of a cognitive consideration, this is where we get Bandura. And Albert Bandura, conveniently, is a Canadian from actually Alberta. So his name is a useful trick for that. But he's known for his social cognitive theory. And this is something that has a ton of different names. It used to be mainly known as the social learning theory, but there's a bunch of other ones that we can use here. But what we care about here in this social, either cognitive or learning, is that we're including not just some of our learning characteristics from our behaviorist start, but now we're introducing some cognitive aspects, some internal evaluations of those learning instances, but also something about social interaction. He didn't necessarily agree with a lot of the ideas that were very core to Skinner's very radical perspective. So, of course, Bandura is famous for the Bobo the Clown study, or the Bobo doll study, whatever we're going to call it. And it's those creepy little sort of almost bowling pin shaped dolls And it's the standard where they had adults interact aggressively with these dolls. And children would observe these adults, watching them be aggressive. And then we'd see how, if the adults were, say, scolded by a researcher, is the child then maybe less likely to be aggressive? Whereas if the adult was praised by the researcher for their aggressive acts, are the children then more likely to emulate that behavior? And that does a great job of illustrating a lot of the core ideas here in terms of what factors are influencing behavior in a both social and cognitive learning based manner. So, this idea is that you're learning from observations of others' actions here. So, we're watching what other people do, we're seeing the consequences of their actions, and we can adjust our own actions accordingly. So, this is something that's sometimes called vicarious conditioning, where if Skinner's idea was of operant conditioning, of learning to adjust your behavior based on the consequences of your own actions, if you are living vicariously, you are living through the actions of others. So Bandura focused on the fact that you can watch somebody else experience consequences and adjust your behavior to either get good consequences that you've seen or to avoid bad consequences that you've seen. So this is where we started sort of this cognitive leaning in that behaviorist sort of string of theories. And this started in and around the 1960s, so sort of moving forward in time for our psychological history. And again, this came up because there was a bunch of people who didn't like the pure behaviorist approach. There's more to human behavior than just reacting to our environment. So now we're introducing that social aspect and internal cognitive evaluations of those consequences that might have a conscious decision in which actions you choose to undertake or not undertake. Again, all the terms that are on the slide here, the social component, the cognitive component, and the learning component, all get tied together into this nice sort of hybrid with a little bit of that behaviorist learning, a little bit of the cognitive psychology internal processes. So it's getting a little bit more complicated here. And so this is meant to acknowledge the fact that humans have thoughts and feelings and conscious evaluations of their actions. We aren't just reactive, we aren't just having reflexive behaviors. There is cognitive and intentional behavior too. So, how are we comparing this back to what Skinner had said? We're learning, but we're not passive participants. We're not just encountering stuff in the environment and happening to see consequences and deciding to adjust our behaviors in the future. We're actually going to do more than that. And we can also actively seek out information in that environment. We can watch others engaging in actions with the intent of figuring out how does their action sort of affect the environment. So if you've ever been in a new environment and you're not quite sure what the procedure is, I know with the new thing they're doing with the one cards where you have to tap at every single door. I stood back the first time and watched somebody else show me how to work that device because my card is notoriously unreliable in the department, so I watched somebody else do it. So they touched a very specific spot on the sensor, they waited a set amount of time, and then they opened the door. I was like, perfect, that worked. I'm going to do that myself now. So I vicariously conditioned my behavior by seeking out information from watching others. So here we're saying, yeah, our environment can influence our behavior, but we are active participants within that environment as well. So Bandura didn't want to dismiss that internal evaluation. We wanted to have more of a humans taking an active role and not reflexive passive responders. And we've also mentioned before the concept of reciprocal determinism, though I'm pretty sure I didn't use the term at the time. But this is what I've said before, where it's not only that we have sort of this environment influencing us, but we can also have aspects of our own behavior influencing our environment. So here, once again, we can actively decide what environments do we go into. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this when we were talking about biological versus environmental factors within intelligence, probably. But the same kind of idea holds here, where you're not just existing in these sort of non-reactive environments, there is a little bit of give and take. So the reciprocal component means that you can influence the environment, the environment can influence you. And that determinism component is all about determining effects. So in this case, we're sort of more of an active participant once again. And again, what else is different here? We're focusing on information processing in terms of internal evaluations and acknowledging the fact that our unobservable internal cognitive events can still be important in understanding why we engage in behaviors. Once again, Skinner was adamant that even if we understood all the internal processes, even if we could document everything going on inside a human's mind, he'd say that that's completely irrelevant in understanding their external behaviors. So he dismissed it completely. You actually see behaviorists talk about it as the cognitive component being almost like a black box that you just ignore and store away. But Bandura and our other sort of cognitive behaviorists wanted to start reintroducing that aspect and wanting to understand what some of those unobservable events are. And of course, like I've said with my chickadee stuff, we're looking at internal categorization, and we don't explicitly need them to state what it is they're thinking. We more want to ask our questions in that behaviorist way, giving them that operant setup, and they can make a choice of hopping in the feeder or not, where certain actions are going to tell us that they are conceptualizing things one way, and different actions tell us they conceptualize it a different way. That's still evaluating those internal cognitive components. So different people, different researchers can have different levels of depth that they want to get into some of those unobservable events. So whether it's just, I want to know how they categorize things, or if you're with humans, you could ask them explicitly, what was your train of thought as you made this decision? All of those are valid applications of this kind of a theory. Oh, and this was just an illustration of that reciprocal determinism, if you wanted more words than just what's in a bracket. But yeah, we're saying that our internal mental events, external environmental events, and our overt behavior are all capable of influencing each other. So even adding in one more component here to break it down, where our actions can influence our environment, but also our thoughts can influence those actions that can then influence that environment. But we can also go further. These are all double-ended arrows. So you could encounter something in your environment that maybe makes you think a certain way. And that could then prompt certain behaviors. But we can also still have kind of behaviorist framed automatic responses to things in your environment. If you've ever been walking through Sub, I know that at least there used to be, a Subway in there. And they have that thing where they set up their fan to circulate the smell of bread. And every time I'd have to walk through there, you'd smell that. And I'm like, I just ate, but I'm actually hungry because I'm smelling something really good smelling. And I feel like it would taste really good. And now my stomach is rumbling. That's not something you're necessarily conscious of. You might even notice that your stomach rumbles and then you figure out what's going on. More of your environment triggers a pretty automatic behavior. So this is just acknowledging that there's lots of different directions information can flow, and everything can have an influence on everything else, hence all of our double-ended arrows. Now, I've already introduced the concept of our observational learning, or this is where we said our reciprocal, nope, not reciprocal, I just used that word, vicarious conditioning, that's the other word I wanted. Both are the same thing we have here, aka vicarious conditioning, but it might be a little easier to visualize with observational learning, but you basically observe somebody else's behavior and learn from the consequences of their actions. And yeah, the one other term we might want in here is the idea of a model, or you might also see it called a demonstrator. And this is going to be the individual that you are observing. So if you watch that person who went and unlocked the door for you with their card, that would be our model. And I would then copy the model's behavior. Or you can simplify it and say, I've modeled their behavior. I've copied it myself. So in those cases, that observation and copying is part of this observational learning or vicarious conditioning. And of course, we can say, what are some of the other aspects? What if we wanted to look at more of that cognitive side of things? We can have the concept of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is your belief about your ability to do some kind of behavior. and that behavior should then lead to a particular expected outcome. So this is a situation of how in control do you feel? How much do you think your actions are going to have an effect? So if you have high self-efficacy, you're pretty confident that you could do that behavior and it would get you whatever the consequence is that you're seeking. So if I have high self-efficacy, I've watched a couple of people open that door. I'm fairly confident in my abilities. I'm going to go and do it myself. And you often then approach that task feeling a little bit more confident. You can also have low self efficacy. Maybe you have concerns that the necessary responses might not get you to that consequence, or that you might not have the ability to execute those responses. As somebody who has been regularly locked out of places, and you've seen my luck with technology a couple of times, I was not super sure of it the first couple of times. So, low self efficacy is a little bit of uncertainty in that situation. And when we start looking at what influences our sort of interpretation of our self efficacy, that's going to be a very subjective thing where it's going to depend a lot on a whole bunch of different factors. And that's going to be very specific to the individual and to the situation that you're encountering. I would say that I'm a lot more confident in things like, say, meeting new people, but I'm a lot less confident about things like getting technology to work the right way the first time. So you can have different evaluations. And what are some of the components that go into that? There's tons of things, but these are some of the big ones. That observational learning can be really important here. My confidence raises, my self efficacy evaluation increases, having observed somebody else do that. They were able to use their card and get into that building, and therefore I'm pretty confident I might be able to do the same. I know the actions, I just have to hope that everything works internally. From performance experience, once I've had a couple of successful attempts, I'm a lot more confident in my ability to keep things working. I've opened this door before, or I've opened similar doors. I'm now a lot more confident in this approach. You can also have verbal persuasion involved, and this can come from either yourself or from others, but basically encouraging yourself. So they talk about positive self talk, hyping yourself up and telling you that you can do it. That can actually help you feel like you can do that. It also really helps if it comes from other individuals. Having somebody to cheer you on can end up being really helpful. And if somebody is telling you you can't do it, it can go the other way. And I suppose all the others can as well. If you failed before, I've had a couple of doors that just weren't quite working for me that day, that leads to more of that uncertainty. And even observation, if you see somebody attempt to do something and they can't do it, you might then worry that you might not be able to do it too. So all of this can be either positive or negative, influence you up or down in terms of self-efficacy. And then the last one here is emotional arousal. And this is sort of a term that comes up fairly often in psychology. And I don't think I've done the disclaimer yet for this class, but when we talk about arousal in psychology, we're typically talking about general states of internal energy. So high arousal situations could be like you're really angry about something, or really excited about something, happy or sad. As long as there's sort of this elevated sense of internal emotion, it counts as a high arousal event. So it isn't explicitly sexual. They'd actually have to specify that it would be sexual arousal in those cases. So if we just use the term arousal in general, it's a generic term. And we'll see that quite a bit because it comes up in things like the stress and health chapter, and even things like social behavior can be influenced by this. And of course, that makes sense. Emotional arousal, if you're really excited about something, if you're really looking forward to something, you probably feel really good about your chances of successfully completing a task. Whereas if you are dreading something, if you're in a low state, then maybe you're a lot less certain. Maybe there's more of that low self efficacy. So your internal state can have a pretty dramatic effect. And even you've seen it here. I've had a couple of those mornings where I'm like, we're off to a great start. A bunch of things have gone wrong. Let's see what else goes wrong. That's one of those sort of lower states because you're in that mentality already. And of course, there's all sorts of other things that can influence. These are just a couple of examples, but it gives us a good idea of the fact that how we approach a task And even how we react to a specific situation can be influenced by a whole bunch of other factors. Some of them can be sort of internal evaluations, external forces, prior experience, all of it coming together. And that all matches really nicely with this particular theory or set of theories, is all tying into not just behaviorist external stuff, but all that internal stuff and social stuff all at once. So we have a couple of other ideas. So pretty much everything so far has been fairly consistent with the starting point with Bandura, but as per usual, it's very rarely just one person. There are others who start adding on to this. So our next thing here is with Walter Mischel, who was another one of our social learning theory proponents, but wanted to add on and sort of shift the focus just a little bit. So here, Mischel wanted to focus on how much our situational factors can actually govern our behavior. So we want to focus not on big picture consistent behavior, more personality leaning according to our initial definition, but they wanted to focus on individual situations in which behavior might occur. And specifically, the fact that we are going to make certain responses based on the current conditions as well as on past experience. And the fact that current conditions can have slight shifts, we shouldn't then be surprised if there are swings in behavior. So we're still acknowledging the fact that people are going to be making responses that lead to reinforcement in the situation at hand. That's very behaviorist basic, where we're learning from past experience. We know that if we make a particular response, it leads to a particular consequence, and that should influence our behavior. But Mischel focused in on what he called the consistency paradox, which basically said that consistency in behavior for an individual is actually very low. So you don't see people engaging in exactly the same behaviors, even under certain conditions that look like they're fairly similar. And I guess I can go with my example here. You're going to be working hard if your boss compensates your effort, but maybe if that boss isn't there to give you that sort of praise, all of a sudden your behavior shifts dramatically. So we're seeing that people aren't necessarily consistent in all situations. And so now we're focusing in on those small differences in a given situation. The presence or absence of your boss is something that's sufficient to completely change your motivation, to completely change your actions in that given moment. Even though if we just went with a standard behaviorist perspective, we'd say that you've learned that when the boss is around, you get praised, and that should set you up so that if you're in the environment of being at work, whether your boss is there or not, that environment should be sufficient to get you to work. But we're saying with Mischel's idea that these very small changes can cause minute changes in behavior, that you're not having just, I learned this thing and I've maintained it sort of indefinitely. Now there's more minutia to it. Now we're focusing on finer details. And of course, this ends up sparking a debate about the importance of considering the person and sort of what's innate to them or what is learned for them versus the situation that they're in and any small changes between situations. And of course, people want to say, well, which one is the most important? And as you might expect, whenever it comes up with a debate like this, is it A or is it B? We usually end up settling somewhere in the middle where it's a little bit of both. And so this was the start of getting us back to that, yeah, both matter. One more thing that we want to add in here. Actually, I think we have to end up with a couple of these specific terms. This is coming from Rotter, who focused on defining what he calls the locus of control. And this is focusing on that person side of things. So leaving the situation for a few moments, I think we come back to it. But with Rotter's locus of control, we're trying to quantify how much a person perceives an outcome as being contingent on their own actions rather than on external forces. Basically, how much power do they think they have in this situation? If you have an internal locus of control, you think that internal forces, things within you, are what is in control of the situation. So the events around you are something that you have direct influence over. And this means that you have this feeling of self determination. So you feel like you can do things and it will have an impact on the world around you. So you have a feeling of personal effectiveness because I can do things and it causes changes. So I feel like I have power in my environment. And because you have that feeling of power, like what you do matters, you end up seeking out information. You feel motivated to sort of make your own decisions and to carry out your own actions. People who have a high internal locus of control end up actually being a lot more involved in their environment. So, this would be, say, people who feel like they could go out and join protests or participate in councils. They feel like their voice matters, and therefore they are more likely to participate in events where they feel like they can make that difference. In contrast, of course, if you have an external locus of control, you feel like that control is something external to yourself. So this would be an individual who feels fairly powerless in the moment. They would say that external forces, things like luck or chance or fate, or even the powerful others in their environment, have more control than they do. So this would be somebody who, say, looked at the government and they're like, well, I have friends who want to go and do protests, but my one voice won't make much of a difference. So why would I bother? So if you don't feel like your voice matters, that your actions matter, you're much less likely to care to go out and try and use that voice. These individuals tend to be less resistant to social pressures because they're not really able to make their own decisions. And the reason for that is because they feel like making their own decisions hasn't really mattered in the past. So they're just going to go with it. They're going to sort of put that control off onto someone else because that's what they've gotten used to. In a lot of cases, once you've sort of settled into either an internal or external locus of control, you kind of end up engaging in behaviors that end up perpetuating that. So if you have an internal locus of control and you're engaging in all sorts of actions where you're making your voice be heard, you're having an effect, you see that you have that power and it solidifies that internal idea of control. And then in contrast, the external, well, people have controlled my actions or people have overridden my actions. I've tried stuff before, it's never worked, so I'm not going to try any longer. I'm going to blindly follow my bossy boss at work, and I'm going to feel powerless. And I'm going to use those instances where I didn't stand up for myself as evidence that somebody else has all the control, perpetuating that too. And of course, that doesn't mean that once you're in one of these ideas, you're stuck in it. You can shift between them, but usually you have to sort of overcome patterns of behavior to do so. And then at the end here, evaluating this behavioral perspective and leaning into the more cognitive perspectives towards the end here, we eventually got to consider cognition. Our early behaviorist ideas were a little bit more extreme. And of course, that always ties back to Skinner and his very hard lines, the external is the only thing that matters. And of course, it got people upset enough to start having extra stuff added in. So we eventually got to a more holistic consideration of other forces. Despite the fact that we started in a very sort of external only focus, because we had that gradual transition incorporating other factors in our environment and internally and social components and all of that, we actually ended up getting a better understanding of both those internal and external factors once all things were considered. So yeah, Skinner stressed the role of the environment, that external component, and that was a great place to start. Then we had Bandura stressing the importance of observing the actions of others, that external component, but with a social leaning, and then having that filtered through a cognitive idea, sort of watching people and making determinations of whether you want to copy or not. And then we start getting Mischel stressing the importance of our situational factors and our internal versus external locus of control stuff when we start looking at the individuals, all sorts of different ideas that are all kind of working together really nicely. And as per usual, we're starting to find that, yes, a lot of these different theories and ideas have very different views, but not all of them end up being conflicting. And many times you can use bits and pieces from each of them working nicely together in tangent. And so, of course, this is all putting some insights from our other perspectives, starting to get some of that behaviorist into a more cognitive leaning component, even some of our social perspectives into a cognitive and even behaviorist leaning perspective. So, a nice mix from a bunch of different areas. And again, that's why I really like this kind of a view, and that's why my research falls under this, because it does work nicely with a bunch of other different ways of thinking about psychology.